Okay, here's an email from Michael, and this is really a good Bigfoot story. I grew up in western North Carolina, 2 miles from the Blue Ridge Parkway. I love camping and being as far away from people as possible. So in the late fall of 1992, I talked a friend of mine into going camping with me to a place called Graveyard Fields. My car was in the shop at the time, so he would have to drive. He said he had to work, so he could only stay one night. Well, I arranged to be picked up 4 days from the start of our trip. This was in the days before cell phones, and that meant when my friend left, I would be truly on my own, which was fine with me. The day was cool, and it was nice. The skies were blue overhead as we parked in the parking area and prepared for the 2 to 3 mile hike in with all of our supplies. I had convinced my friend to help me carry in a cooler full of drink that we called PJ. This was corn liquor, fruit punch, citrus soda, and whatever kind of fresh fruit was available. It was heavy, but I kept telling my buddy that it would be worth it. We didn't see but a couple of people on our way in, and I knew the perfect, well-secluded place to camp off the trail. We made it to the laurel thicket and then had to find a way to get through them without ripping ourselves to pieces. And when we did, it opened up into a small grassy area with a small feeder creek 15 feet from where the tent would be. We got the camp set up and a fire started, and then we made ourselves a cup of PJ. And when we started getting hungry, I made us some tinfoil dinners. I seasoned some ground beef and cut up some potatoes and onions and carrots, and I wrapped them tight and put them in the coals to cook, and it was great. Around dark, we were talking and wondering if anyone else was crazy enough to camp in the temperatures dropping below freezing when we heard a woo-hoo. I was pretty sure that it was other campers a ways off, so I answered back, "Woo-hoo!" We did this several times until it got late. Then we decided to turn in. It was an uneventful night. The next morning, we woke up with frost on our sleeping bags, so we were in a hurry to stoke the fire and get warm. Shortly after breakfast, my buddy told me, "Man, I gotta go. Are you sure you're gonna be okay for 3 days way up here by yourself?" "Yeah, I'll be fine," I told him. My ride would be there before noon on the 3rd day. He took off, and I spent the day getting wood and then relaxing at camp. Around dusk, I decided to make a small pot of stew. Not that canned stuff, but some real beef tips and vegetables cooked over the fire in some good beef stock. It takes a while to cook, so it wasn't ready until after dark. And by then, I'd had a few drinks. I made a bowl and sat back and looked up at the stars. It was a clear night, and the sky was beautiful. And then I heard that call again. Woo-hoo! It was still a good ways off. I sat for a minute, and I wondered if I should answer back before finally responding with my own whoop. All went silent for a few minutes, and then came an answering whoop, and it still sounded like it was at least several football fields away. I sat and thought about what kind of idiot I really am. If this is others with bad intentions, I'm giving my location away each time I answer back, and I decided to turn in for the night. Sometime in the morning, before daylight, I could have sworn I heard someone or something walking near the laurel bushes that surrounded my campsite. And I chose this campsite because it is almost impossible in the daylight to find a way through the laurels. At night, I imagine you'd tear yourself to pieces trying to get through it. I was very tuned in, but after a while of not hearing anything else, I drifted back to sleep. Once again, I woke with frost on my sleeping bag, and after warming up by the fire, I decided to see if I could find where and what was walking by the laurels. I looked and I looked, but I didn't see any tracks or anything else that would indicate anyone had been there. And I spent the rest of the day gathering wood for the night to come. I had a huge fire going before dark, and I decided to cook dinner. The last night of camping, I always like to eat good. I was going to have a T-bone and potatoes and onions. The smell of that cooking was heavenly. I still had some PJ left and I was not about to carry it out alone, so I started in on making sure the cooler was empty when I left. After I ate, I was sitting there enjoying the night and looking at the stars when here came another whoop. This time it sounded like it was closer than the night before. It came from my 1 o'clock. I was quiet and didn't answer this time. And then suddenly another whoop came from my 6 o'clock, and it was only a couple of 100 yards away. And I guess this kind of freaked me out. I hadn't seen any other campers the whole time I'd been there. I was sitting there thinking about what this might be when another whoop came from my 1 o'clock, and it was much closer this time. Right after that, a loud whoop came from my 6 o'clock, and I decided to stoke the fire, and I stacked plenty of wood on it before getting into my tent. I laid there in my sleeping bag, intently listening, and another whoop came from my 1 o'clock, and it sounded closer still, followed by a whoop again from my 6 o'clock that was very loud, and yes, even closer. I was getting nervous. At this point, I pulled my Case XX hunting knife out of its sheath and I laid still. And then I heard footsteps at my 6. Not light footsteps, but heavy. I swear I could feel them in the ground. And then I heard more footsteps at my 1 o'clock. Oh man, I thought, what am I supposed to do now? I decided it was best to lie as still as possible because whatever was walking out there was big enough to shake the ground. It had to be huge, and there seemed to be 2 of them. I heard branches breaking, and then because the fire was still blazing, I saw a huge shadow on my tent. I heard my pots and pans being moved and the lid of my cooler that still had fruit from the PJ in it being opened. Another shadow from my 1 o'clock crossed my tent and joined the other one at the cooler. There was quite a bit of fruit left in there. The thing about that fruit is the longer it sits in the PJ, the more alcohol it absorbs. This fruit had been soaking up alcohol for 4 days, and it had to be strong. I was a nervous wreck, but I managed to stay still as I heard my stuff being thrown around, and eventually the 2 shadows disappeared in the direction of my 1 o'clock. Needless to say, I did not sleep at all. At daylight, I unzipped my tent and I saw all my stuff all over the place, and I decided to pack up and head to the parking area ASAP. The hike out was uneventful, and I got to the parking area 2 hours before my ride was due to arrive. That was okay with me. At least I was okay. I'm not really sure what was in my camp that night, but I have a pretty good idea. I still can't, but I'm always armed with a long rifle and a 44 mag handgun. I don't want to wind up missing. Michael, I bet you don't, and that would have scared the crap out of me. I mean, to be laying there with the light illuminating the outside of your tent, you actually see these 2 creatures or whatever they are, shadows, digging through your gear, and there's really nothing you can do about it. I mean, do you step out and confront them? Or do you just lay there like you did, be totally silent, maybe even act like you're asleep, and hope they go away? Apparently that's the way that works. So guys, take note of this. If you're ever out camping by yourself, shadows start walking around your tent, just lay real still. There's a proven method to survive a night with Bigfoot coming into your camp. I thought this story was great, Michael. Thanks for sending it. Welcome to the podcast, Dixiecryptid on YouTube and the What If It's True podcast on the podcast network. You can listen to us everywhere. All right, enough talking. Let's jump into this video or podcast. Come on, here we go. My father owned a green Ford Aerostar van. It was a piece of junk. The power steering whined when he made turns, the engine ticked, and it was slow. But he was able to keep it running, and this was our main mode of transportation in Manitoba. And in Manitoba, it takes hours to get anywhere. I was a kid then, and I remember that we did a lot of traveling in that van. I don't know where we went or why we traveled that much. I guess it was my father's business. I just remember driving down long highways for hours during the day and late at night. It had to have been 2 or 3 in the morning on one of these trips while we went as fast as the van would take us down a dark highway lined with dead pines on both sides. The area is referred to as the Sticks here in Manitoba. It's a spooky place to be in the daylight, much less in the dark. My head rested on the passenger door as we listened to loud music. My father always had the volume loud. He loved good music. I was used to it, so I sat there in a numb state watching the dead pines fly by in the glow of the headlights. My ear was close to the window, and I could faintly hear footsteps crunching in the gravel. I figured it was part of the music, but the noise continued between the songs. Whatever this noise was, it was running and keeping pace with the car. We were about to enter and drive through Riding Mountain State Park, where the speed limit was reduced, so my father, who obviously had not heard the noise I was hearing, slowed to the speed limit. I reached to the radio and I switched it off. "Do you hear that, Dad?" I asked. "I do. What is that?" he said, looking over his right shoulder through the back windshield. Abruptly, he pulled the car over on the gravel median and he opened the door. With one leg still in the car, he stood up and he looked over the roof. He immediately dropped back into the driver's seat, threw the car in gear, and floored it. Gravel sprayed behind us. I got real worried, but I don't know what he saw. The dead pines blew past us now faster than before, and with his high beams on now, the road was lit well enough for me to see far ahead. We traveled a short distance, and the footfalls were back on my side of the car again. My father pushed the gas pedal harder, and that clunky old van picked up not much speed. But whatever was running beside the car was having no trouble keeping up. I turned in my seat to look, and what I saw is hard to describe because it was so big that I could only see the legs in my field of view. I leaned over in this seat to tilt my head up, and although I could not make out any details, I did see how big this very fast thing was. At my age then, I would have said it was 2 stories tall. I think that's about 7 meters or 20 feet. I don't know, but it was enormous and it was powerful. Watching the black, hairy, muscular legs run beside the car scared me to death. My father was freaking out as well, but he held it together and he kept driving. There was no place to go but straight ahead. And then the foot stomps began to fade in the distance. I began to breathe again and Dad slowed down some. We never said a word. I wanted to get back to the city lights, and I think he did too. We were coming off Riding Mountain Pass, and a large green sign was in the distance ahead. Our headlights made that sign reflect like a ship coming to save us on a stormy sea. I watched the sign get closer, and I saw a huge, shadowy figure cross in front of it. It had run fast enough to get ahead of us. Maybe through the pines, maybe on the other side of the road, and we had just missed it. Dad pointed ahead and he said something that I never heard. He pressed me back into the seat. This night was not over yet. The sign was coming up fast, and I guess my father decided turning around was an exercise in futility. So while we were going downhill, he gave that tin can as much gas as it would take. I felt like we were driving 100 miles per hour, and my eyes were fixed on that sign. I saw the creature move behind the sign and lower itself as if it were hiding. Huge, dark hands were visible where he held on to the top of the sign, blocking the reflective glow. "If this is it, then this is it," I heard my dad say under his breath, and I knew something bad was about to happen. We were almost even with that sign. I pushed my feet against the floorboard and I gripped the armrest. But at that moment, a calm peace came over me. I was just a kid, but somehow I was able to prepare myself for whatever was about to happen. In some strange way, I was ready. We blew past that sign, and this creature did something I never expected. Just as we were even with the beast, it poked its head out from behind the sign. In the headlights, I could see its face. Orange eyes reflected back at us. At the last minute, it extended its head, almost touching the passenger side window. For a split second, we were face to face with a thin sheet of glass between us. At that moment, I saw eyes as big as golf balls, 2 slits in its face for a nose, and 2 rows of white teeth as it smiled at me. It was more of a sinister grin, but it was a smile all the same. Suddenly, I got the feeling that it was messing with us. After seeing its speed and obvious strength, I think it could have swiped our car right off into those spooky dead pines at any minute if it had wanted to. We were now a good distance down the pass, and the car filled with an odor that I cannot describe. We didn't want to roll the windows down for fear of this thing still being close, but the further we drove, the less offensive the odor became. I am an adult now. All the years since, I assumed that this was a Sasquatch, but now I don't think it was. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was a demon or a troll. But I'm pretty sure it was not a Sasquatch. It was something worse. I still deal with bad dreams over that night now. They are less frequent as the years go by. I doubt I will ever forget that night. And my father has never said a word about it since.
This story comes from a lady who says it's true, and it falls into the category of elementals and psychic powers. When I was in my late teens, I was asked to work at a music camp in Ontario, Canada. As a member of the staff, I was required to arrive a couple of days early. I met another girl, and our job was to get the cabins ready for the students to occupy them. On day 1, we worked to clean the cabins and got the kitchens cleaned. That night, the 2 of us chose which cabin we would sleep in, and we went to bed. We laid there absolutely silent, exhausted by all the work we'd done that day. After a few minutes, we heard footsteps. We were both still awake, and now we were wide awake. We heard the steps coming up from the basement. They were getting closer and closer. We listened as it moved through the cabin, coming towards us. When it got to us, we could smell it. Even with my eyes shut, I could see it. I knew I would be in danger if I made eye contact with it. It was ancient with long black hair. It stopped, and I think it studied us for a moment, but when we didn't respond, it moved on. It was an elemental. It was evil. It smelled like death, and it was putrid. In the morning, we discussed it. I was told that some of the students from the previous year had dabbled in black magic. They had conjured this thing up. There were other things that were also reported to me that occurred the previous year, but I won't mention those. I've always been aware of my own psychic abilities, so I was alarmed at students experimenting with black magic. They had no idea what they had done. We discussed what had happened with the executive of the camp, who brought someone in to deal with it. I don't know of any further occurrences that might have happened that year, but a dark, uneasy feeling hung over us the rest of the time we were there. Many years later, I had a reading by a shaman and took the opportunity to ask him about it. He was the one who told me it was an elemental that had been conjured. He also told me that he had never seen an aura like mine. It's pink. I know I have protection. I have had many psychic experiences throughout my life. I have a natural knowing that can't be explained. I did nothing to get it. It's just part of me. In fact, it runs in the family. My mother had it, as did her mother. At Christmas, the year I was 17, I was working in a nursing home and waiting for my grandmother to pass. She'd been in a coma for 2 weeks. She awoke and we were all summoned to the hospital. She saw us and smiled and raised her hand to point upward. I knew she was telling us that she'd been in heaven for those 2 weeks. We all kissed her and went home. 2 days later, while I was working in the kitchen of the nursing home, I was hit by a jolt of electricity in my solar plexus. Along with that sensation came the immediate knowledge that my grandmother had said goodbye to me. She'd passed. I waited for the phone call to come from the hospital, telling the nursing home to let her bed go. About 2 minutes later, it rang. I knew the nurse on duty would be coming to tell me about my grandmother. As she entered from the hall, my coworker entered from the dining room. I stopped her and said, "I already know." She burst into tears. My coworker was confused, so I explained that my grandmother had just passed. They were both stunned that I knew without the benefit of a telephone. My grandmother and I were very close, though. My mother had nearly died when I was born, and I'd spent the first month of my life in her care. I suppose this is the reason we were so attached to each other. There really are spiritual attachments. Since then, I've known many times when people were going to die. I even saw a murder, but that's a story for another day. Let me know if you're interested. Well, my dear, I'm pretty sure Cam will be interested, and if not, I certainly am. So send us that story. I'd love to read it.
12 years ago, I found myself suddenly a single father with an amazing 8-year-old daughter after her mother left our lives. I had to become both father and mother overnight and raise our beautiful daughter alone. I was lucky to secure a beautiful property north of Brisbane in Queensland, Australia, and we began to heal. This was an amazing old property, around 10 acres on the outskirts of a smaller township. The house was old, but the land had an amazing combination of old trees, small cleared paddocks for our horse, old tropical gardens, and a series of creeks that ran down one boundary to form a billabong. This was the place my daughter and I needed. Our horse was our buckskin lawnmower. He was like a puppy, and he followed us around when we went on bushwalks. Given the size of the land, my daughter was also able to keep chickens and ducks. She would be their little mother. They all had names and would come to her for hugs and cuddles. We had no cats or dogs, so wildlife was abundant. We had black cockatoos and kookaburras, possums, brilliant kingfishers at the creeks, and hundreds of lorikeets. One morning I went out back of the house and discovered chicken feathers scattered in the backyard. I followed a trail which led to the far side boundary near the creek and found a larger pile of feathers. I assumed that a fox had come in and taken one of my daughter's birds during the night. I cleaned up all the feathers and later told my daughter what I had found. She asked if it could have put up a fight and gotten away. It was possible. I had only found the feathers. We made sure the chickens were locked up tight that night onward. They were free range during the day. One weekend, we went away to go swimming at the beach, and when we got back, we quickly realized that more chickens and ducks had been taken. The trail of feathers once again led us to the forest near the creek. Still, we found nothing but feathers. A few weeks later, winter had set in. It does get cold here in Australia, but only for a few weeks. During that short time, we enjoyed fires outside. It was a good time on those chilly nights. Because the property was so big with lots of trees, I never had to buy firewood. I would just gather pine cones and branches from the property to burn. Some nights I would take a large old washing basket and a torch and go stick picking around the property to gather something to burn. I wouldn't let my daughter come with me at night, but she would stand on the front veranda and watch me go around with a torch. I didn't want her to follow in case of snakes or spiders. We have some big ones here. And I never traveled out of her sight. One such night, I had filled the basket with sticks and pine cones and was walking back up the long driveway back to the house. I had the torch in front of me and I walked alongside the driveway fence, which was about 4 feet high. As I got within around 50 meters of the front of the house, the front spotlights were on from the roof and I could see my daughter waving. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a large black cat-like creature run between me and the fence towards the house. It was fast, but very close, within 2 meters to my left. I turned the torch onto it and I watched it lope forward until it got to a large overgrown hibiscus that grew beside the carport. These gardens were old. The original plants had grown to enormous sizes over the years. The hibiscus had grown to a large dome-shaped mass of thicket and branches, but it was hollow inside. The chickens often nestled in there. My daughter saw the creature run past me, and then she asked what it was. I wasn't sure and still had the torch on it, and I saw it enter into the big hibiscus. I wasn't sure if it was still there or had gone out the back into the forest. I told my daughter to stay where she was at the front door, and I approached the big shrub expecting to find nothing. I shone the torch into the bush, and staring back in the torchlight was the biggest set of bright neon green eyes. The creature was so black that even the torchlight was not picking up the detail. The eyes were really big. They were the size of golf balls and spaced at 25 centimeters apart. There was no sound, but I could see its nose wrinkle up in snarls. It exposed a huge mouth with big, white, sharp teeth and whiskers. The eyes were wide open, but I could see its brow furrow down in anger. The thing that hit me was its wildness. This thing was powerful, large, and foreign. Australia has no official big cats, but I could see from its eyes and their reaction that it was pissed and defensive. I've seen pictures of tigers with their ears laid back and snarling, nose wrinkled up with full fury, and this was exactly what I saw. I told my daughter to go straight back into the house, and I backed away slowly, keeping the torch on this creature's face. It kept shutting its mouth and then baring its teeth, but no noise ever came out of this thing. I backed away and made it to the house, and I shut the door. A week later, I saw a council vehicle pulling up at our front gate. I walked down to the property entry, and the officer asked me about our buckskin horse. They had found one down the road an hour earlier and thought that it might be mine. I looked around the property and called out for him, but no sign of the horse. We walked the fence and found a spot where the fence had been crushed to the ground, obviously where the horse had escaped. This was unusual, as he was a real house pet, never flighty or spooked. He was so docile that he was more like a dog than a horse. The council officer said it looked like he had been herded into a panic in the corner and pushed the fence down and then ran through. His guess was a pack of dogs had run the horse out. I didn't say anything about the recent encounter, feeling I would be seen as a nutter. The officer radioed to his other council workers, said it was our horse, and a few minutes later they came up the road leading him back. The horse was worried about the property, kept looking over all the areas, nostrils wide open and ears up and flicking around. I led him onto the property and he slowly calmed down, but he hung around me like a shadow. We noticed some big scratch marks down his left flank. 4 big scratch marks in a row from the middle of his back down his leg and around his backside. Each scratch was around 3 centimeters apart. They had broken the skin, but he would not need vet treatment. One of the officers said it might have been by the fence when he got through. The other officer said it looked like a big cat, only to be shot down quickly by his superior, saying it was a fence injury. There have been many sightings of big cat encounters in Australia for many, but the media and the public in general dismiss these as fantasy. I've never publicly admitted this encounter to anyone, and we have moved away from the property. All right, here's kind of an odd story. I don't know the name of the writer, and that doesn't matter. I got this quite a while back. Anyway, I just think it's an interesting story. It's really odd. This person writes, there's a McDonald's that is 4 stories tall where I grew up. It was pretty big news when it was built. The tall slides were a local landmark for a while. Our middle school went there for field trips, and our track team would run to the tower and back for practice. It was at the center of a square used for car shows and pep rallies. The 4-story playground was paradise for children and teenagers. The ball pit, the rope bridge, the N64 games kept everyone entertained, while the slides were the main attraction. It was quite the climb up, but the payoff was sure worth it. The giant slide was equivalent to the top thrill dragster at Cedar Point. It was a thrill ride, especially with our modification. We would sneak the food trays up with us and bobsled them down the slide at super high speeds. We were thrown out and chased out a couple of times after some trays were broken. The Evel Knievel stunts were a blast, but they were nothing compared to what happened one innocent summer morning. We walked from Southwick to the McDonald's for some breakfast. I had hot cakes and sausage with water. The boys ordered their meals and met me in the back to eat. We played Madden on the consoles, and I enjoyed free refills of Powerade with their cups. The place was fairly busy, but we pretty much had free roam of the entire back area, and that was our hangout spot. It came time to watch them play, and I figured I would burn some time, and I started wandering around looking for coins and dropped knickknacks. I was inspecting around under a table when a kid tapped me on the shoulder and said someone was looking for me. I figured it was one of my buddies. I was confused, but I climbed into the jungle gym and I began crawling to the top. I didn't know what to expect. Was one of my friends from school hanging out at the top and watching us play all along? Was it a girl that I knew? I moved slowly, checking every corner as I sprawled through the cushion and rope. There was a strange feeling in the tube, and I could tell that something was up here with me. I arrived at the top and I didn't see anyone, and I retraced my steps, and I felt something cold in the center of the facility. I creeped closer, slowly, expecting someone to jump out and scare me, and I heard some movement, and I turned to the corner to a new section of the playground that I never entered before. I must have been oblivious to this bonus compartment all along. The air was crisp, and it felt like I was outside. I was in a new world, and I crawled on my hands and knees, and it opened up into a larger chamber. I didn't know where I was, and I rubbed my eyes to make sure that I wasn't dreaming. And then I was startled when I heard a voice. It was familiar, but I couldn't recognize the source. I turned around, and to my surprise was my childhood friend Max. I hadn't seen him in a decade when his family moved away. He looked like he hadn't aged since the day he moved. I asked him what was up, what was going on. He just smiled and said that he had fun at my birthday party, and that he missed playing soccer at recess together. I told him that I hope he was doing well and that I tried looking him up, and he breathed slow and softly said that he was in a better place, and I gasped and I connected the dots. Max smiled and said they finally built the playground that we've been calling for, the slides that touch the sky. He laughed and replied that we thought we had it good at Burger King. That playground on Boston was the birthday party he was referencing. I was excited to tell him about the tray trick that we were using to get up speed. He said he knew exactly what I was talking about, that he had been watching. I told him to meet me up at the top and I'd be right back. And I crawled back down to reality and the light blinded my eyes. And I snuck quickly and grabbed a tray and I scurried back up and was surprised when he was nowhere to be found. I searched for a few minutes, but I could feel that he was with me, and I set up a tray and took off full throttle. Max was with me the whole way. I could feel his grip on my shoulders, and we twisted and turned and laughed. When I reached the end of the tunnel, Max's blanket of energy was gone, but I was not sad. We completed our mission. I knew he was waiting for that moment, and somewhere in my spirit I was too. Max was my best friend, but in the days before cell phones, when a friend moved away, you just wish you had a chance to say goodbye. I had had my last chance. What a great, heartwarming story. That's all I can say about that. I'm kind of awestruck at how sweet this story was. Thank you to the writer for sending it. I really, really enjoyed it and appreciate them sending it to me. And for everyone to hear, thank you very much. This is a wonderful story. It's kind of a scary story, and I hope you guys like it. I don't know the name of the writer. Let's see. She just signs it Utah Desert Girl, and that's good enough. That's good enough. Let's jump into it. I was raised in the desert area of Utah in the small town of Caneville, population 15 on a good day when everyone was home. This town was so remote, it was 30 miles to the west to the nearest town and 20 miles to the east of Hanksville, which is just north of Hyte Marina on Lake Powell. Only a handful of cars pass through our town on Highway 24 on a busy day. My father was a desert tour guide, and he knew the Utah desert like the back of his hand. So I was raised rough camping in the desert with my parents and their friends. For several years in the spring, Dad would lead a group called the Wonder Bunch on a 3-day camp trip into the desert and canyons of Utah. They called themselves the Wonder Bunch because they always wondered where they were going, and wondered who would be going, and wondered when they would make it back. I love going on the Wonder Bunch camp trips, which usually had 75 to 100 people in the group. Every night, after eating a great meal, several men would get out their musical instruments and play songs around the campfire. My dad played guitar, one man played a banjo, and another played a harmonica, etc. While they played, some of the others would clear an area of brush and rock so we could dance in the sand. Most of the time, square dancing or doing the old-fashioned waltz or two-step. And if people didn't want to dance, they just sat listening to the music or singing along if they wanted. It was usually long after the moon had come up and the fire had died down that we would finally retire to our beds beneath the stars. In May of 1968, when I was 15, I talked my dad into letting me take 5 of my girlfriends on a weekend camp trip, a girls-only trip. Since we were teenagers, their mothers were concerned that some of the local boys might find us and cause trouble. So Dad promised that he would take us where no one would be able to find us. He wouldn't even tell me where he was going to ensure no boys could find us. On Friday, after school, we loaded all of our camping gear and 6 girls into Dad's 1966 International Travelall, and we headed out to the desert for a girls' weekend of giggling and fun. Dad loved to entertain and pull practical jokes, so at the right time, on our way into the desert, he stopped the vehicle saying, "I'm sorry, girls, but I have to wee." Of course, being in the desert, there wasn't any bush or large boulder in sight. While Dad stepped out of the Travelall, the girls turned their heads and covered their eyes. And then we heard Dad yell, "Wee!" long and loud before getting back into the driver's seat and continuing on our way. Of course, the girls had a big laugh over that joke. After an hour, we stopped at the head of the Caneville Wash, about 5 to 7 miles from my home. We hurriedly unloaded our gear, and Dad told us that he would be back to pick us up on Sunday afternoon before he waved and he drove away. There was a full moon that weekend, and Friday night went really well. We set up camp and spread our bedrolls in a line in the bottom of the wash where it was sandy and soft, and then roasted hot dogs around a small campfire. Since it had been a fairly long day, we went to bed as soon as it got dark, and all went well that night. On Saturday morning, after eating breakfast of burned bacon and pancakes and eggs, we straightened up camp and decided to do a little exploring of the area. I loved to gather rocks as my dad had taught me the difference between petrified wood, dinosaur bone, jasper, quartz, flint, and other types of rocks. The wash had several small canyons and gullies that ran off of it, which were perfect for rock hounding, so we hiked some of them until it started to gently rain. We hurried back to camp and stowed our gear on a ledge beneath an overhanging cliff so it wouldn't get wet. The storm was just a summer cloud burst that only lasted a few minutes, so when it was done and the sun came out again, we decided it was time to suntan. We spread our bedrolls back out. Since we were up on a small canyon in the middle of the desert with no one around us for miles, we stripped down to our bras and panties and then laid face down on our sleeping bags to get a good tan on our backs. And then someone suggested we didn't want to get the bra line on our back, so we unhooked the back of our bras and just laid there in the sun. All of a sudden, one of the girls noticed a jet flying over, so we all squealed and jumped up and ran to the overhanging cliff, leaving 6 white bras lying in a row on our bedrolls. After a moment of panic, we realized a jet flying that high, probably at 30,000 feet, couldn't see us anyway. But our suntanning mood was over, so we got dressed again and we did a little more exploring before it was time to cook supper. I remember at the very head of the wash was a natural seep with just enough water for us to wash our hands and do the supper cleanup. Before long, the sun had set and our day of fun was over, so we put out the fire and we crawled into our beds. They were still at the bottom of the wash, and we quickly fell asleep. Sometime in the night, we were awakened by a small sprinkling of raindrops. And I told the girls we needed to move our beds out of the wash and up under the overhanging cliffs so we wouldn't get caught in a flash flood if it rained any harder. The desert canyons of Utah are notorious for flash floods. If people aren't cautious and aware of the weather and their surroundings, they can end up in a life-threatening situation. Throughout the years, Dad had rescued several people who had been caught or stranded by flash floods. Anyway, the moon was full that weekend, so we had no trouble gathering up our beds and quickly getting underneath the overhang out of the rain that was coming down a little harder now. And as soon as we were all under the overhang, before we even got a chance to spread out our beds, a light came down from the sky and began to search the area in the wash where we had been sleeping only moments before. The beam of the searchlight was 15 to 20 feet in diameter, and it was coming straight down from the sky. However, there was no engine noise, only the hushed breathing of 6 terrified girls. One of the girls tried to stick her head out from underneath the overhang to see where the light was coming from, but 3 of the other girls held her back for fear that she would give away our hiding place. We realized the light was not normal, and we sensed something sinister was happening, and we were frightened. Like I mentioned, there was no motor noise of any type of noise, just the silence of the desert. And we watched in fear, and the light searched our camp area, and it swept the bed of the wash where we had previously been sleeping, and up the side of the hills and cliffs that line the wash. After 10 minutes, the search beam of light disappeared. We saw a bright light shoot to the north and do a 90-degree turn and shoot to the east and over the horizon. It was gone in a matter of seconds. There was a temporary military base to the east of us, maybe 30 miles, between Hanksville and Green River, Utah, and I have wondered if it had anything to do with this incident. It took a while for us to settle down and go back to bed and sleep the rest of the night. I might also mention that there was a small flood that went through our camp and right down the wash where we had been sleeping earlier. Thankfully, no one was hurt. None of our camping gear was washed away. The next day was Sunday, and it was just afternoon when Dad came to pick us up. We excitedly told him what had happened and how the light had come down from the sky and had been searching for us. The blood drained from his face, and he just said, "Hurry and pack your stuff. We need to get going." So we loaded everything in his trusty Travelall, and he drove us back to town. It wasn't until many years later, when I was an adult, that I learned about the many strange objects he had seen in the skies of southeastern Utah. As I remember this night in the desert, I'm very thankful that we were protected and not abducted. In my heart, I feel the Lord saved us by sending that small shower to wake us up and get us to move underneath the overhang where we couldn't be seen from above. I can only imagine how horrific Dad's life would have been had us girls gone missing, especially since he was the only one who knew where we were, and the last one to see us on that Friday night when he dropped us off to start our camping adventure. Throughout my teenage years, I saw other strange lights in the sky, but they were not as frightful as this one. This craft was definitely looking for us. It's a puzzle to me how it knew where we were. I know Daddy didn't tell them, and, as Dad promised, the boys didn't find our camp, but the UFO certainly did. And she signs off Utah Desert Girl. Utah Desert Girl? What a great story. I had this image when you were describing the light beam, of course. Everything in my head always goes back to Close Encounters, the Steven Spielberg movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and those lights when Richard Dreyfuss is trapped right there on top of those railroad tracks. In the distance, you can see as the UFO moves over him and goes past him, that light kind of beaming down, kind of hums and beams down and then goes out, comes back on again and goes out and illuminates the road below. What a cool experience. And I know it was scary for you guys, but I would love to see that. I would love to see something like that. But anyway, thank you for the story. It was a wonderful story. And I think that's going to wind this podcast up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. Appreciate you.